members of the class of 2025 from down the street, across the country, and around the world. Around the world, just as it should be.
Harvard University President Alan Garber making a jab there at President Trump's efforts to strip the Ivy League university of its ability to enroll foreign students. Within hours of those remarks from Garber, Massachusetts federal judge Alison Burroughs put a temporary injunction on that order, prohibiting the federal government from making any permanent changes to Harvard's student visa program.
But the administration says this is another case of judicial overreach. Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller even going so far as to call it a judicial coup, and pointing out that this all started after the university refused to cooperate with a sprawling records request from the Department of Homeland Security. Take a listen.
Harvard defied multiple DHS subpoenas for information about its foreign students and about law-breaking and national security threats on campus. Harvard has engaged in decades of invidious, unlawful, and illegal race-based discrimination against American citizens. So Harvard is engaged in illegal and criminal conduct, and a judge is siding with Harvard's right to pad his pockets with foreign cash over the rights of American citizens and the American Constitution.
Piers Morgan ripped...
Yeah, so that's not to worry.
For later.
That's a preview of something that's yet to come.
I just got back from vacation, so you got to give me a break.
It's quite all right. When people will not now have their appetites whet for what we're going to say about Piers Morgan in a second.
Yeah.
What I'm going to say about Harvard is that I think that the Trump administration is using the kind of charges that Stephen Miller was making there as a way to invade and erode Harvard's academic independence. I know we'll have another difference of opinion on this one, but to my mind, first of all, Harvard, contrary to what Stephen Miller says, has in fact made efforts to provide much of the information that the government has asked for. What it has declined to do is things like, for example, comply with a request to get any information of international students participating in protests at all, not acts of criminality, not illegal protests, but they were asked to provide any video or audio of any protests that international students were involved in. They're not going to do that. The other point about the Trump administration and its requests is that it involves or includes a audit or the request for audits of Harvard departments where the government would approve the auditor. Harvard, rightly, in my view, isn't going to concede that point because it sees it as the government getting its fingers into academic freedom and eroding that freedom.
Yeah, I'm less excited about the Trump administration's attacks on the international students and their right to be involved in protests. I mean, I think in some of the cases you had individuals who were expressing quite extreme ideas that were counter to American national security and foreign policy, which is understandable that if you are inviting someone to come study in your country, you don't want someone who is going to come in and cause chaos. But what I think is the stronger point for the Trump administration is that Harvard for a long time was violating basic civil rights through affirmative action and employment, through Title VII, and then through Title IX with both the inclusion of gender ideology as a protected category in addition to sex, as well as affirmative action admissions programs. Now, obviously, the admissions programs were struck down by that Supreme Court case with Students for Fair Admissions, but Harvard tried to intentionally work around that legal barring by deciding to have students write impact statements where they were encouraged to write about things like race and identity. So it was a way of getting students to tell them what their race was without just checking a box on an application and being able to consider that in the admissions process. And they still continue to use affirmative action for hiring. So for me, the reason for pulling the funding from Harvard should be predicated on the fact that they are openly violating federal law as it relates to anti-discrimination metrics. But then when you get into the international students and pulling their visas, this is obviously a sort of additional punishment on top of pulling the grants, pulling the federal funding away from the university to try to get them to comply with those requests from the Trump administration, or demands, I guess you could say, from the Trump administration. And one of the things that I always find really interesting about the debate about international students is that it's sort of predicated on this idea that the reason that international students have to come study at Harvard or other U.S. universities is because we're getting the best and brightest from around the world. But I think in practice, that's not really how it works. The reason that universities like to have international students come study is that typically they're paying full sticker price for tuition. So they like to have international students to subsidize the financial aid, grants, scholarships that are going to American students. And if you're purely financially motivated to bring international students in, particularly Chinese students, because you don't want to have to pay out of your own coffers to have American students who are the best and brightest to come study there, then that's a problem for me. And to me, that's the key argument for why the Trump administration should have some kind of restrictions on how many of those students are actually allowed to come here.
So first of all, on the affirmative action question, I'm not in as total opposition to your position as you might expect. I do think that if you look at Harvard's admission rates when they are broken down by race and academic percentile, that there are rather pressing questions there about whether there is, in effect, I mean, the whole charge of anti-white discrimination can be kind of a bit toxic at times, or can sound a bit toxic. It is certainly the case that Asian Americans have a case to make there also, that their admittance rates are unfairly kept low in pursuit of diversity. Now, in relation to the impact statement part, I have a more generous view of that than you do, I think, because I think it is acceptable and indeed desirable to have people communicate something about the totality of their experiences, because we don't in fact all start from a level playing field, and the unlevel parts of it can be to do with race or class or lots of other circumstances in people's lives. So I don't really object to that. On the point about international students, Amber, yes, I do agree that they are broadly financially advantageous to the colleges and universities, and that financial advantage can often be utilized to subsidize the education of American students. I don't really have a problem with that. I think that is advantageous both ways. I don't see that as a zero-sum game. And I don't really think it's fair to suggest that the people are not the best and brightest. It seems a logical fallacy to me to say because they're paying full sticker price, they're not the best and brightest. Like that's not necessarily the case at all. If somebody wants to traverse the world from India or China or Taiwan, some of those big feeder countries for American universities, it's generally because they are extremely bright, and it's very rarely, incidentally, because they're wanting to pursue the kind of courses that outrage many conservatives. It's often because they want to further their own education in STEM kind of subjects.
Yeah, but I think the point where it's because it's not fallacious, because if you were purely seeking the best and brightest international students, then surely there would be some who are coming from poor circumstances, need some kind of financial assistance, and yet we see in the vast majority of cases, if not all of them, that students are paying full price. So I just find it very unlikely that all of the best and brightest international students are also the ones who are able to pay their full way, right? I'd also find Trump's comments about the remedial math course they've had at Harvard quite compelling. I mean, the idea that you have to teach your Harvard students basic algebra is a further indication that they're not admitting the best and brightest students, because if they were, then surely they'd have people who had completed some higher level of at least algebra 2, maybe calculus, right? Maybe an AP calculus course. So that's very concerning to me that their academic standards have dropped so much, apparently. And sure, like there's a public school system issue here, but it's hard to imagine that you couldn't find enough students to fill Harvard that have some level of English and math excellence.
Proficiency, yeah. And I think there's also part of the argument there about standards declining because of COVID, school closures and all of that. I do want to make one very final point, because I know we're running long, because it's an interesting topic. But you mentioned this being part of the broader sort of, well, you wouldn't use the word assault on Harvard, but I will, the kind of attack on Harvard and the pulling of the grants and all of that. I do find that very self-defeating for the United States, and this does get to the best and brightest argument. The pulling of grants from an elite university like that is in fact handicapping research projects that could benefit the nation as a whole, and is making a less appealing atmosphere in the United States for leading scientists and researchers. And, you know, while Trump is talking about pulling grants, what's happening in places like Europe, for example, they're delighted about this and are putting their own schemes in place. The European Commission wanting to spend 500 million euro in the next 3 years to try to lure scientists to Western Europe. So that's my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely an argument to have a certain level of international visas available for students. And look, other universities are still getting them, right? This is specific to Harvard because they've refused to comply with federal law. But on the point that Secretary of State Marco Rubio was making yesterday about Chinese students, where it's a full ban, I think that's more compelling to me because the CCP does have a lot of control over what those students do, where they go, what they study, whether they get to come back to China to see their family or not. And there's been a lot of indictments over the past 10 years of both professors and researchers stealing research and intellectual property and sending it back to the CCP. So that's a legitimate concern because there's the spying element involved. I'm always admiring of your research, and I am not expert on exactly the circumstances around Chinese students and their links to the CCP. So I'll give you that one. Thank you. The tease I was supposed to read is now here. Piers Morgan ripped into the Israeli ambassador to the UK over the war in Gaza, and that is next on Rising.